there's your actual action, but it's, and I actually come on to this in the next slide, but how will that action actually bring about change? Because I think if you look at Iraq, where you had very heavy sanctions, like there was no one really had a clear idea as to how that was actually going to provoke change in the country. So if you want to look at, say, more developing nations, it may be a case of saying, whatever, you've got the dictator of Zambu-Zambuland, and his main supporters are, whatever, army generals who own large tracts of land, and they own large tracts of land and make a lot of money themselves through exporting agricultural goods. So the trick may be to target the sanctions on the exports of their particularly big supporters or whatever, if you want to try and get rid of the particular dictator or put pressure on him. Diplomatic sanctions, you can say, whatever, try and like take away FACEM, keep them out of the British Commonwealth, keep them out of various African groups. I'm not convinced that they work at all. I think they usually just spin that around. Targeting the ruling classes, which is kind of what I came back to in terms of targeting sanctions. So you can target, let's say, a group of people. So if farmers are their big supporters, target farm produce, if it's whoever, go after that. Sports sanctions is a debate that actually has come up a fair bit over the years. So whatever, excluding them from the Olympics, excluding them from hosting the Olympics, keeping them out of Rugby World Cup, Soccer World Cups, whatever. Think about sports sanctions. There's actually a whole debate around there that might be worth having to think about because it's something that comes up. And arms sanctions, which I think is something entirely uncontroversial, where I suppose it's a case of you are blowing people up, we will stop you buying weapons. I don't think it's one which I'm going to dwell on. Arguing sanctions, I want to get into this a little bit more. From prop, it's important to show evidence as to how your specific sanctions will lead to change within that country. Like, what you want to avoid is, like, it was the example I mentioned a minute ago, Iraq, where it was like, we will put sanctions on them and we will punish them. And so often in debates, people say, we're going to put these sanctions on them and that will make them change. You need to explain why it is that that change will come about as a result of those sanctions in a bit more detail. That's the number one thing that gets missed in any sort of leverage debate, whether it be sanctions, whether it be tying aid, whether it be who are the decision makers in that society, what makes them change their mind, who are the people who have influence over them, how will that change their attitudes? Will it actually change their mind? Because empirically, most of the time it actually doesn't. Most of the time sanctions actually have a minimal effect. Generally, if sanctions are going to have an effect, they're actually something which more have an effect at the threat of sanctions. If it gets to the stage where sanctions are imposed, it's likely that the regime or government or someone who are going to tough it out, look at North Korea, look at Iran, not exactly, you're seeing a massive amount of change there. So if you have, this is something which applies to beyond traditional development debates, but if you're talking about putting some sort of sanctions on North Korea, think about which kind of sanctions are actually going to affect Kim Jong-il. Like, you kicked him out of whatever random international body, he's not going to care. It's not something that is an issue for him. But on the other hand, I don't know, he may be someone who cares a lot about prestige things in terms of sporting sanctions, may be effective because of the way they're treating their football team after the World Cup. I'm not going to get into that in any detail. But it's a case of think about exactly how will that mechanism work in the circumstances which you're proposing it. There's several avenues from up. I'm not going to get into them in a massive amount of detail. Think about the unintended consequences of the sanctions beyond the obvious, like this is going to kill babies because they can't buy medicine. But it's a case of, look, conversely, what is going to be the impact on the politics in the country? Is it just going to, I suppose, make him stronger? How will he turn the rhetoric on that? Will it, if you as the West say, we're doing this to improve women's rights, is it actually going to up the rhetoric from people who say, no, they're trying to impose their values on us about women, maybe we should take a harsher stance in terms of what to say what our views are. Sometimes it can actually make things even worse. One of the big things, I suppose, which we've seen in the past has been where the United States, we'll say, has tried to support, let's say, opposition groups in some countries. Sometimes the unintended consequences of that has been you actually make them even more unpopular. Public suffering, so it's a case of like, you may be putting some sort of sanctions on, the generals all sit happy in their palaces with their like women and beer and food, but on the other hand the people are starving and dying because they don't have medicine. On the other hand then it's a case of like, even if you get rid of them, is someone else just going to take their place? So if it's a case of getting rid of, again I'm dwelling a little bit on getting rid of people here, but it's a case of if you replace that dictator or if that government folds, are you going to get something even worse? I suppose is the question. So, and then public attitudes, which I think I kind of touched on, is it's a case of like, how are the public going to perceive these actions? Next one, tide aid.
Sorry?
Yeah.
The point about others taking their place.
Yeah.
Can you use it without offering an alternative to, let's say, no, we'll invade them and then we'll put someone better? Or because saying another person might, just as bad, might take his place.
It depends on which side you're on. So it's a case of if you're the one advocating a particular policy, you should be quite clear in your idea as to who will take their place if they fall. So whether you're invading them or whether you are just putting pressure through sanctions to, say, get rid of this government, you should have some idea that, like, what's going to happen if we actually get this government to topple, who's actually going to be likely to fill that vacuum. On the other hand, with opposition, like, you just need to be able to paint that ambiguity. You just need to say, like, Prop haven't given us any idea about who's going to come into power. So it's a case of, like, if you go back a couple of years and people were arguing for assassination of Saddam Hussein, Prop really needed to be able to argue, if we kill Saddam Hussein, here's who's step into the vacuum. Prop can say, like, it could be one of a number of things. Someone from the Ba'ath Party could take over and they could be even worse. It could be Chemical Ali or whoever it is. It could be that the government will fall apart and you'll see a civil war, whatever it may be. So it's a case of, if there is a change of regime or change of people, or that action happens, like, consider, could it be worse? I suppose that's probably what I'm getting at. Tide aid. I would break this down into what I describe as two things. Fluffy good tide aid, where we kind of say, and I meant to put that in parentheses as well, but it's a case of saying, like, we're going to tie aid to your progress on rights. So things which on the face of it look good, okay? Social goals or whatever, tends to be debated more, because there tends to be a bit of, it tends to be a bad debate because it's just one of those things that's just very grounded in reality. What some people term like bad tide aid. So like the United States gives lots of money to X country, but part of the condition is that they will then turn around and buy trap, or whatever it is. Like, I think that's one of those things where people go like, look, that's kind of bad, but at the same time though, I actually think there's an argument for that kind of stuff, because getting your country to give aid to a foreign country can actually be politically quite difficult sometimes, and if you can say it's actually showing some benefits for you, then there's an argument for saying it's actually better than nothing. But I won't dwell on that. Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think there are certainly arguments you can make, and I come back to that on other motives in the next slide, I think it is. But it's a case of look for what other motives can be implied by you or by the people receiving the aid. So it's a case of what's actually. So it's a case of two things. So if it's a case of that China, for example, are giving a lot of support to Sudan or a lot of investment, you can certainly suggest things in terms of in a debate saying, like, if China are providing this sort of aid to Sudan, this is what the implications are of that support or whatever it may be, because China's just have the resources, blah, 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 blah. But on the other hand, you can also say, how are the people going to perceive that aid being received from that particular actor? So think about if you're talking about aid debates, think about perceptions of what the motive is for the donation of that aid. Next one, types of aid. Once again, like, this is something which hopefully I'm not going to dwell on, because I think it's hopefully people should be aware of. But just consider, like, so many times you get tied aid debates, people don't specify what kind of aid you're talking about. So it's a case of, like, I would almost always say, so if you're saying we will tie aid to the development of women's rights or whatever it may be, like, I would make it clear you're not talking about emergency or disaster relief. Like, we're not going to not give Pakistan anything in their floods because they haven't made enough progress against the Taliban. There's actually an argument for saying you should be giving even more to try and win hearts and minds there. But I suppose the argument is that I think it's generally quite clever if you have a debate about aid to say, like, look, what we're talking about is more so the development aid. The second thing is to have a bit of an understanding as to development aid, how that comes about. So it comes about, I suppose, through three main channels that I'm aware of anyway. One is government to government, where whatever, countries just give countries loans, cash, whatever it may be, goods, and it goes to government. And think about what the implications are of the channel that aid takes. So if it goes government to government, does that mean that they will just spend that aid on their health budget, reduce their health budget and spend more on guns? Okay, so think about what the mechanism as to how that aid is delivered and what the implications of that can be. Government to domestic or foreign NGOs, so it can be given to, we'll say, so the Irish government gives a lot through an Irish charity called Concern, the British give a lot through, we'll say, Oxfam, or you could give, we'll say, a lot of money to, we'll say, the Red Crescent operating in Pakistan. What are the implications of the organisation? How legitimate is that organisation? Is it more independent than the government? So if you were arguing an aid debate, you could say, like, look, we think primarily we would work through domestic NGOs or whatever to try and bypass the government if they're reliable, blah, blah, blah. And basically there's different implications depending on the type of aid one is discussing. So just consider the type of aid as well. So I think people